today I wanted to take us through the psychological and the sociological basis to the spend personality module that we have been promoting recently. The idea is to not spend too much time on product, but more time on the constructs and the theories that have gone into creating and refining and building the spend personality. If you do have questions about more of the technical aspects of it, there are a couple of members of my team on this call as well. Thanks, guys, for being here. That'll be able to answer some of the questions that are more technical in nature. So today, what I wanted to go through was to introduce this concept. What is the spend personality? And then to further understand how this understanding has been built up from the various theories that we've looked at. So it's looking at the psychology and the sociological influences, and then how those have been broken down into computational terms in order to create these algorithms that can then understand and derive and extract personality from transactional data, specifically financial transactional data in this sense. And then I can give you guys a bit of a view of what the personalities are themselves and possibly a few of the practical applications if we get that far. All right, so spend personality is designed to understand the individual through those transactional engagements, through transactional data. So you have this attempt to move beyond what the current forms of segmentation are. Now I've got the sort of funny little chart in the bottom left corner over there, which seems a little far-fetched that we would still be categorizing people by their income, but it's actually very common, right? And yet it's not a very clear way to understand a person, because you can't really assume that a person that falls into that high earning category is actually that far different in terms of the person that they are to the lower earners. So it's moving beyond demographic segmentation, and it's moving beyond this relatively one-sided view of human categorization that we have, and finding the individual. What are the various levels and the various elements that make up this one person? And then we derive that data from their spend interactions. Now, the ways that we get there is to understand the human. You need to understand the human constructs, right? And so we've looked at four main areas of this. At least there's four main areas that we've delved into with the spend personality. This is not necessarily everything, but it's the best way to give a clear picture of exactly what we're looking at here. So to start with is the psychology. Now, this is a little bit of a difficult area to discuss in terms of the spend personality, because something important to note about spend personality is that it's not about the human. It's about the human's interactions. Let me start with understanding the human, because there are humans behind those transactions. So there are three main areas that we can look at in order to derive an understanding of human-based rhythms. Now, Carl Jung provides us with a very great view of these two base personality traits, which is extroversion and introversion. That can then be layered on top with the scoring system that the Ocean model provides, which is also known as the Big Five personality traits. And then this is then put together, and then using the cognitive biases which come from behavioral economics, you can then understand how to translate that into spending terms.
Just as a question,
yes.
You mentioned earlier, and I might have just misheard you. Are you saying that your spend personality is different to your normal personality, your
yes.
human personality? Is it always the case?
Not necessarily. Most of what we've seen is that the individual personality would be different to the way that you spend. And we're creating that siloed classification in order to not get ahead of ourselves with trying to say that we can identify your human personality through your transactional data, because it's quite naive, right? This is more about understanding the rhythms and that personality that's shown through those rhythms. To use the introversion and the extroversion example here, Rob, you could be an introvert innately, you stay at home, but you could spend like an extrovert, right? And your spendings could show that. What I wanted to do was to hopefully present an idea of how we've gotten to this point of being able to actually extract a personality score. So Jung provided us with this great view of two sort of different classes of people, which is your introverts and your extroverts. Now, this has got to do with intrinsic motivation. There's a lot of narrative around what it means to be introverted and extroverted. And with regards to Jung, it's more about motivation. It's more about the reasons why you're doing a thing that you're doing. We commonly understand that an introvert will stay at home. But according to Jung's theories, it's not necessarily that simple. It's not like, oh, okay, cool, I stay at home, so I must be an introvert. It's more about the reasons why you do. If you stay at home because you live in a hostel full of people, well, then that would make you more extroverted, right? So we've then taken the stimuluses, the various ways in which people will be driven to perform an action, and layered that then with the Ocean model personality scoring system. Now, the big five, as it's called, or Ocean or Canoe, there's various different ways that it can be understood, is made up of these 5 different personality traits. So more than just the base traits of introvert and extrovert. This is more about these 5 traits that can have various levels for an individual person, and that can actually change during certain parts of a person's life. So Ocean stands for what? Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And you're either high in a certain trait or low in a certain trait. And then that sort of gives you an overarching view of a more sort of nuanced view of that person. Now, we've utilized this in order to derive this personality score. So you can understand it based on these various levels. Now, the next sort of part of it that's actually very important is to encapsulate these ideas with behavioral economics, psychological understanding as well. So this is where we can then begin to understand, again, it says reveal the irrational aspects of spending. Irrational outside of psychology has a relatively negative connotation. In this sense, it's just what is common and what is not necessarily common. So it's common for humans to buy food. It's common for humans to buy transport or to spend money on transport. It's common for them to spend money on fees. It's also relatively common to spend on luxuries and things like non-essentials, but it's within this space over here that we get a view of more of the individual rather than just those commonalities. So it's in those irrationalities, it's in those irrational aspects that you can begin to see certain spreads, certain styles of engagement, certain networks, if you will, like you can see on the right-hand side, where you'll see the red ones on top are more of your extroverted spenders, and the one in green is more of your introverted spenders. Now, some of the things that it also allows us to do is to extract whether somebody is more inclined to certain psychological triggers, for example, loss aversion or sales, things like that. And what does that say about the person's spending personality? Now, the human is a social being. We are a part of society, unless we are, on a farm somewhere and you're on your own, which in this case, it wouldn't necessarily apply to you at all. We are social beings, right? And so we have to also understand the societal constructs and the sociological constructs, at least, in order to understand the spend personality. As I mentioned before, it's those individual nuanced spends outside of the common elements that then provide you with a view of who the human is. So 3 of the primary constructs that we looked into for this was social functionalism, social constructivism, and then also interestingly enough, with symbolic interactionism. Symbolic interactionism is a little less so. This is a point at which I would very much like to get to, which is, yeah, I'll get into exactly what it is for now, but I just wanted to say just a notation, the image on the right was generated by AI, and yeah, I was quite surprised by it. I happen to, I think it's quite cool. It is not very often that I am impressed with the AI generated art, but I thought it was quite inspired. All right, so functionalism, right? Let's get a view of functionalism. Functionalism is about society being dominated and underpinned by certain institutions, right? We are taught to behave in certain ways by the institutions that we're surrounded by and by the institutions that uphold this thing, this collective thing that we ultimately exist in. So, you know, it informs the way that we would educate our children, how we would educate ourselves, and what we consider to be worth education. So if you end up in a space where it's commonplace for people to have tertiary education, then seeing spans of tertiary education is not necessarily an indication of that individual's spend personality, but rather an indication of the fact that they exist within this societal space. And those needs are commonplace, right? Furthermore, functionalism gives us a view in which you can see how people would spend, or at least view, things that could be considered a luxury versus those that are not a luxury and an essential, like the example that I gave just now. Right, and then alongside that, there is this construct of constructivism, which is that humans participate in society. So this is a little less about the institutions that inform and a little more about the individuals that inform the activities that person participates in, and how one can see the shaping that's formed in terms of how a person conducts in conversations with one another, how those transactions can be shown to, or at least how those transactions can be viewed to show the social elements of that individual person. And this is where we can get to symbolic interactionism. It's, you know, alongside the constructivist, alongside the functionist theories, is that person then acting in unique ways within those societal structures, within those societal norms, within those pillars of society? So one great example is if you can see somebody that spends their money on more sort of sustainable elements or sustainable products rather than just spending as spending comes. This will often have something to do with their constructivist environment, as well as then certain personal indicators as well, certain rhythms of personal ideas that can then be seen within their transactional history. So at this point, this is where we get to the crux of everything that we're talking about now. It's taking those human ideas and building algorithms off of them. This is the point. We want to be able to get to a point where it's not just me as a human on the other side looking at reams upon reams of stuff to try to understand who the individual is on the other side. That's just not a very economic way to do it. To rather get this in a space where the machines are able to then identify what these certain human traits are. Now, in order to do that, what we designed was this series of metrics that help to identify certain personality types on a spectrum. So you have things that are built on this time, place, and act trifecta. What is the time at which certain transactions happen, or at least what are the time frames in which certain transactions happen as well, which is quite important, especially when it comes to interaction data and not just transactional data. And then the locations, is it the locations in which the transactions happen, or the locations that people tend to seek out to perform a certain transaction? And then that can then give you a view of the purpose of what these transactions are. And that's often then inferred and derived from the previous two. In this case, two of the metrics that you can see there that we used was things like, how do you find evidence of habitual behavior, right? Or how do you find evidence that somebody has gone into performing a certain action with specific amount of intention, as opposed to just happening upon something. Yeah, and then this is how you can then get the spend personality algorithm, which is what we've got in our platform. So this is where you can implement the algorithm in order to understand and at least derive a clearer picture of what each of these metrics are for each and every individual person that's in that space. And then you can group them. I don't want to use segment because that has a different connotation to it, but you can begin to then group people into certain styles. And this is where these personalities start to take shape within your customer base, right? And these groupings will give you a view then of what is commonplace. So the blue, teal interactions, the transactions in the center there, those are shared, right? Those are shared across the board. But you can see each of those sections that are flowered are each of the personalities, right? And they have their own very unique set of transactions and rhythms and styles in which they perform those that can then be seen within that space and within your customers' transactional data. So this is where, now the data science part of it is more Eric's specialty, but I can definitely speak to what we've got over here. But if we have any questions with this over here, then you guys must definitely let me know. Right. We use this data science aspect of it. It's to understand, how to identify the evidence of the human activity. Now, everything that I've been talking about thus far is ultimately to give you a view of the evidence, right? What is it that means human? What is it that means individual? What is it that means an intentional personality or an extrovert personality? And how can you use those metrics to then see who these people are within your within your customer base? So you have examples of people that are either daily spenders or habitual spenders or repeat spenders. Now, something interesting to note, which is what Rob brought up just now, is somebody can be a certain personality with you, but a different personality with a different bank. So there are a lot of people out there that'll have multiple bank accounts, right? And they will do that for specific reasons, right? Bank A gives you these perks for these types of transactions. Bank B will give you these types. Now, to be the daily spender or the habitual spender, which is ultimately what you want, is that you can then see, are they spending in ways that are commonplace, and are they spending in ways that provide a unique perspective of who they are? And that can tell you whether you are communicating with them in the right ways, whether you are promoting the right products to them, or even if you're making the right offers at the right time to them. If we could just look at the evidence of an intentional personality within the space. Now, intentional is very much in the name. You've got somebody that will go in and that will perform an action. That's why they're there. There's a point to everything that they do. And I'm looking at this in the extremes. You don't want to go in and halfway through their journey decide to offer them something that has nothing to do with what their initial trajectory is, because they're just going to ignore you and everything's going to go to the wayside. Whereas if you've got someone like an experiential customer who tends to want to look around a little bit, who wants to maybe perform multiple actions and have these experiences within that, they've got an idea of where they're going, but not necessarily bound to that particular action. You can be a little bit more explorative in the sense. You can be a little bit more suggestive to offer alternative routes within time frame. So this, by the way, it's got a lot more to do with app data, but it can also be applied to how they interact with your banking app and how they would spend within that space as well. And then we have the view of an enthusiastic customer, which is somebody that will go in, no real intention in mind. So oftentimes offerings that'll happen at any particular moment within that journey would be likely to be taken up. Yeah, if not, just browsing around and discovering things. Now, I was hoping Jay would be on the call to talk a little bit more about this, but I can just say that the whole point of all of this is to find that sentimental equilibrium. It's to find how to communicate with this person at the right pace in such a way that gets them to not feel overseen in this sort of like uncomfortable way that people are approaching personality at the moment, but rather just to be understood in an unconscious way where everything just feels right, where you enter into a space and everything that's offered to you is, oh, damn, I actually needed that. Not, why am I being sold something now that's got nothing to do with me? So the personalities. Just before we get to the personalities, I wanted to make a note on understanding your personality base. We had a client, as an example, who we did a lot of this work with, and through implementing the Spend Personality module, we were then able to discover and identify that they were exceptionally good at speaking to introverts, right? Everything about the way that they placed their banner, which was just as you log in, there's something that pops up and gives you information, as well as the language that they were using in the messaging while the customer was in, as well as push notifications and emails as well. They were very good at speaking to their introverted customers, the introverted customer base, but they were completely missing that extrovert part of it. And so with just breaking up certain messages and having two options of a message, they were then able to continue to speak to the introverts the way that they were, but to also pick up on the slack that had been happening with regards to the extrovert. And in some cases, it was just a subtle narrative change in the message itself. It could have just been the use of an emoji rather than just straight up language, and also offering things at different times within the app journey. And there was a major uplift in that sense that they saw. So I've been talking a lot about these personalities. I'm throwing out all of these words like intentional and enthusiastic and extrovert. So what are these personalities actually? So they are just like the OSHA model, right? These are metrics that help you to gain a view and an understanding of the various aspects and elements of a human's spend and their spend personality, the way that they interact with their finances, particularly with regards to spending. I'll get to the money personality in a minute, right? And the output is a score that can then help you to talk to that person in a different way, to offer to a person in a different way. So the reason this also exists on a spectrum is because, as we very much understand now versus with like 1900s and even 90s style psychology, is that people are changing beings. People are continuously growing and morphing. And this is particularly prevalent in the financial landscape, within the financial sphere. You cannot say that you were one personality in your 20s and you continue to remain being that personality. Everybody will know this. Sometimes we can shift and change within the space of a year, considering how much our lives change. And so this scoring framework allows you to then update and adapt and ensure that you are continuously changing with these people, with the individuals that you are trying to communicate with. Now, in this sense, real time is very important because you can see the subtle changes. Is somebody an enthusiastic at 12% today, and they happen to be at 13% tomorrow, and then 14% the next day? Is there this very obvious shift that's happening within this person? And how do you preempt that? How do you find a way in which you can use that to your advantage, in which you can use it to their advantage in order to say, hey, listen, obviously not in these terms, but you would offer them something that falls in with their abilities of that given moment in time. With the score, like I mentioned, you can have various outputs, right, with various use cases, some of which I'll mention in a minute. Just to give you a view, and I wanted to use this metric again, because it's a great example of how these personalities are defined. Now, I don't want to go into sort of giving you an exact definition of each of these personalities, because there are subtle nuances depending on the space in which they occupy with your bank, right? But based on these metrics, right, you have the intentionals who are considered very introvert. They are highly deliberate. They're highly organized. There's a lot of intention in the way that they interact and engage and the way that they spend. And that can be seen in the categories in which they spend with, as well as the rhythms with which they spend. Now, moving slightly more towards this ambivert, I mentioned too much about that, but the ambivert is the intersection between the introverts and the extroverts. And this is where you would have more of an industrious personality type, where they show high levels of deliberateness, but they are slightly less organized, and they are perhaps a little bit more explorative than what you would find in your intentionals or your introverts. All right. And then moving more to the extroverted side of the spectrum, you've got your enthusiastics, which I gave you a view of just now, which is somebody that will perform with a high intensity. They will often spend with a high intensity. There's oftentimes no real, what is the word, habitual perspective or viewpoint of how they've been spending. And then you'll have the experientials that, as the name puts it, they will spend for experience. So this is where they will be more explorative. They will often show a high tendency towards enjoying gamification and things like that. So just to briefly mention this, the money personality algorithm is also part of this spend personality construct. However, the money personality has got to do with more of the overarching financial interactions. The way that you save, the way that you get yourself into debt or don't, the way that you just interact with various aspects of products rather than just the spending part of it. So this is where you can have your own understanding of your savers or your planners, or the organized or the cautious ones. So for the practical applications, this is, there are a number of ways in which this can be used, right? But spend personality, as I've been speaking about it now, is very much about just understanding that person. That's the part that excites me, is to take this data, to take this transactional data and to extract these pictures of the people within that database, within certain categories and groupings within all these financial transactional sets, and to provide you with a score of that person. So once you have that score, there are various ways in which that score can be used. I've already mentioned a few of them, but you can use it to engage with them. You can use it for wellness. You can use it in order to activate someone. A great example is for credit card activation. People will oftentimes, they'll get a credit card and they will, so that they can have it, right? And it costs the bank money in order for them to be given the credit card. And then if they don't use it, that's then still costing that bank money. So how do you get somebody to start using that? How do you get somebody to start building that credit score? And you can use the score, the personality score, in order to encourage and to intervene and to nudge somebody to use it, and so that they can have that reciprocal relationship with you rather than just constantly taking that. And then the sort of ultimate is to then upsell and cross-sell based on this information. There are various touch points at which this can be used in various places across the bank. I mean, I'm not going to talk too much about this. Rob, I'm not sure if you have perspective on this part of it over here.
Yes, Jess. So this is really a timeline of generally how how humans move through our financial organization. And as you mature, let's say as you get older, your personality might change. And the bank needs to take that into account. When you're young and you're flashy and you're spending money that you just earned, you might want to be told about offers to spend more, or you might want to get both. Get offers that make you feel good about spending, but then you also want to make sure that that the bank is thinking about you long term and saying maybe it's time to think of a home loan and put some of that money that you're earning away. And you could send two different messages. So the person's extroverted and they want to spend, but if the bank wants you to be a long-term lifetime customer, send them a message that's gonna benefit that customer down the line. And essentially what you're doing is through the life cycle of a person with a bank, your messaging can change based on the stages of life that they're in, and connecting that to your spend personality. Jess?
Yeah, and on that as well, it links directly to the use case of retention, right? To make sure that they spend that entire life cycle with you rather than reaching a point at which they're going, okay, cool, I'm earning a lot more and I'm not seeing the benefits that I would want to. Let me go to a different bank. So rather get them to open another bank account with another bank if they want to, but how do you get them to continue to use you as your primary? And this is where that personality can then factor in.
Just as well as you can also track personality changing as an indicator for other behaviors. So if the person generally is younger, let's call it, and generally they're enthusiastic and they're spending a lot, and then the time between transactions gets bigger and they're not spending on the same things anymore, their categories change. That delta between the two could indicate that they've got another bank card, because just because they're not spending on food with you doesn't mean they're not eating. They're probably spending it with somebody else, and therefore your messaging could then evolve to say you did enjoy us in the recently. What do you want to spend differently with us, just to encourage them to stay with you? So it's easier for a bank to retain you rather than to try and get new customers.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, here we've already spoken to a bit of this, but just to give a view of, and I said I wasn't going to speak too much about the product, but I just wanted to give a view of how easy this would actually be to implement, really, which is you would take that initial categorization, you would categorize these spends, you would need to know things like food and transport and what are the luxuries, what are the essentials, what are the non-essentials. And then you would apply the spend personality and the money personality in order to gain an understanding of that individual. And then you would go and, apply these different use cases to it as well.
Jess, I think unless you want to carry on, I think it is 9:45 at the moment. I don't see any messages in the chat.
So I just wanted to give a bit of a conclusion. So
Okay.
I'm just running through this at the moment. If anybody wants to see this, they can just let me know. But yeah, in conclusion, this is stuck on the wrong thing. There we go. The whole point, the whole purpose of all of this is to provide a framework for understanding and engaging with your customers beyond the current level of personalization. Who is Jess in the world? How is she spending? And what are the best ways that you can then human to human sort of get her into that good space with your bank? That's my closing statement. I don't know if anybody else had.
Fantastic, Jess. Well, really interesting, really thoughtful. I could just say that we haven't had too many people dropping off, so I think everybody's been entertained and fascinated with what you've had to present today. So if you would like the last couple of 10 minutes to ask a couple of questions in those interaction diagrams that you picked up, do you think that different industries and different technologies show different behaviors? Maybe like this: if you're on your banking app compared to your retail app, would the framework be different?
In theory, yes. If you can look at spend personality, I did mention it's got very much to do with bank to bank. I think that would definitely change depending on what kind of a space you're spending in. So let's say that the difference between bank and retail is that with a bank, you're expecting your money to be protected, right? You're expecting to have a space in which you can store something that is for your benefit ultimately. Whereas in a retail space, you're out there to get things for you. You're shopping. There's a difference between the shopping and what you would do with your bank. So yes, your personality would be quite different. I think that's where more of the engagement personality would come in, as opposed to just the spend personality. So while spend personality looks at your categories of spend and the rhythms which you spend within those categories, your engagement personality looks purely at your rhythms and how often you would engage in a certain space or interact in a certain space. And it could be applied as far as products. We don't have a product personality, but it's definitely something that would be exciting to create. Is there a certain kind of character that spends on certain types of products and those alone?
Jess, what is your opinion or your thoughts on, now you've picked up Rob at a bank, he is normally introverted, but any £5 that he's got in his bank account, he spends. And then he likes to spend a lot of money. And then when he interacts digitally, it's different. And how do you reconcile the fact that you've now engaged with Rob and you thought he was extroverted, you sent him extroverted messages, he doesn't respond to those, he responds to those messages as an introvert. You've engaged with him, you know something about him, you've engaged, and it's not quite what you think, or his spending still continued to say introverted, but now that he's engaging with you in a different way. How does that affect that sort of concept of the spend personality?
So I can't necessarily speak to that, but more to the fact that would be a prime example or a prime space in which to experiment. Where you can try to derive an understanding above and beyond what the sort of example construct is, right? So you've identified that Rob is speaking as though he's an introvert, and yet you've identified extrovert. Then you would continue to run experiments with the rest of your customer base. The whole idea with this is to scale. So yes, you want to understand the individual within that space, but you do need to be able to scale. So if you are the anomaly, if you're the outlier, then it's not necessarily that important to spend that much time trying to identify, okay, what is the discrepancy between the fact that you're not responding to what we think you're going to respond to. But if there is a much larger group of people that are not, you can then start to run experiments and understand what are the differences in these nuances. Is it in fact that they're not extrovert, but rather more ambiverted, and you've got them as an experiential and they should be more of an enthusiastic personality type? And what are the ways that you can play around with the language? Now, something that I haven't mentioned yet with regards to the platform is the generative piece. Now, the two ways that we use it is first for natural language data querying, but also for a space in which you can figure out how to change your language and to change your narratives in order to appeal to these different personality types. The example that I gave just now with the bank that was really good at speaking to introverts, you can't just up and change what it is that you've been doing over the years. You want to speak to different groups of people, but you're so used to being able to speak to this group of people. So this is where the generative component comes into it quite nicely, because you can go in and you can speak with we've got our custom GPT, but also embedded in the platform itself, that's got these psychological and these sociological constructs embedded in them that can provide you with examples of ways that you can change your language in order to speak to different people.
I was wondering how much base data you needed on someone before you could decide how you would interact with them. Because if you get new clients, how long and how much information do you need before you can start sending them either introverted or extroverted information?
So that is where we fall into this space over here. That's a great question. Great question. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know, right? And this is where experimentation comes into play. This is where companies like, Spotify and Pinterest, they really get it right. And we apply and employ the same techniques in order to try to figure out what is it about these newer people and ways in which we can get these newer people to respond and to interact with us. And you can run your explore exploit algorithms to see how to then attract certain personality types. I mean, you can run these campaigns by personality type, and that can then help you to not just get a view of your customer base, but also to then tailor who's coming into that space as well. I think Eric might have, I don't know if you're here, but I think you might be able to have a good answer on that as well.
Yeah, so I think you covered it pretty well. I think the idea is to continuously learn as you get more and more data. So there's not necessarily a threshold where it's like, now we have enough. It's like from your first interaction with someone, your first interaction with someone should improve your second one. And if it's your very first, then there's either you just pick something, or if you know something about them, you can try and estimate what their personality might be, or just use an approach that's not based on personality, but some other kind of machine learning based approach to get a kind of a very first interaction. But yeah, the idea is that you kind of enhance it over time and keep, every time you interact, you should learn something about that person.
Thank you. I was actually wondering, Eric, I think you're quite poised to maybe answer the question that Moritz has posed, which is how can these personalities be used in other verticals? So for example, mortgage origination or vehicle financing. So he says here, typically credit applicants submit 3 months bank statements. Would it be possible to determine a personality type at that point in time with just those statements, and then use that to determine the optimal engagement strategy?
So it would potentially be possible. I think two kind of speed bumps with using bank statements that get submitted for credit applications is, one, often like the scanning of them is very difficult to extract information from, assuming that people either send you PDFs or the things are scanned in a readable way. And not, I've seen some very horrible credit bank statement scans that are accepted as proof of income that you can't really automatically extract anything from. But assuming you can do that, it's definitely something that's worth attempting, because it will give you information. It is generally going to be their spending personality with a different institution, because generally if they're with you, you can probably use they can use their state, they can use this, like the transactions they have in their current account or whatever with you to do that application. But there is information there. I think there's value to be had in doing that from a kind of scoring and behavioral engagement kind of strategy. But you just have to bear those two bits in mind. One, you have to actually be able to get data off those statements, and two, it will be slightly less relevant because it's for a different institution to your own.
Do you see this being used to assess the risk of interacting with customers? So for example, if you get a new customer, you do a dynamic risk assessment as part of your KYC. Do you see this as something that can be used to identify a person might be higher risk if he is a spender, a big spender, or something like that?
So I think, it can be a factor. I think, again, one, there's the question of, are they a client with you and you're expanding their portfolio? I think in that case, it's more applicable than it's someone you have no information for and they're maybe giving you a bank statement. I think obviously something to bear in mind with a lot of this risk-based stuff is a lot of it is regulated. I think you can use it to enhance things, but potentially, I don't know which specific application you had in mind, but a lot of the time you actually have to do it in a pretty fixed way. And so it would depend. But I think especially if this is an existing customer that you're either managing their risk on an ongoing basis, or I think that's probably the most applicable if you're doing your like behavioral credit management stuff. But potentially if you're onboarding them for new products and things, you could also use it. If it's a completely new customer to the organization, a bit less, and then you have to bear in mind how regulated whatever risk assessment you're doing is.
I'd like to just formally thank Jess and the rest of the team that have been contributing to this presentation. if you've got any other questions or comments that you'd like the team to respond to. But thanks everybody for your participation today.
Thanks, guys.